Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Today is Monday, January 20th, and this is another of our bi-weekly SIG Apps call. My name is Mati and I'll be your host today. A quick announcement, release 133 has started last Monday. So that was January 13th. We're 1 week in, not much has happened, but the key dates so far are the enhancements freeze is February 13th. So all the enhancements that you are working on, please make sure that they are reviewed by that date. The sooner the better. Usually the last couple of days is busy both for the SIG approvers, but also for the PRR, which stands for Production Readiness Review, especially that some of the SIG leads are also PRR approvers, so be mindful of the fact. And as I'm going slowly through the PRs already, the volume is low as of yet. So yeah, definitely start sooner than later. The next important date will be March 19th, which is when the code freeze and test freeze will happen. The entire schedule is at the provided link with a small caveat. Not all the updates, because we've been having last minute changes to the actual timelines. The PR updating those dates, which I was just covering, is not merged yet. So the dates you'll see currently, I just checked it, the PR is up, but it hasn't merged yet. So don't be scared, there is a PR that will be updating, and hopefully that should merge within a day or two at most. With that, we can jump over to the main topic, which is informing controllers about failed evictions. Paul, you want to introduce us to the problem? And
So I'll give a bit of context. So I own a lot of the upgrade code for Azure Kubernetes Service. And several of my peers have pointed out that while we do a decent job with our QoS, we have a customer fail rate of about 1 to 2%. So thousands of people fail their upgrades all the time. And we look at it, it's mostly pod disruption budgets. And I kind of pointed out, like, well, there's not too much we can do about that. But it is interesting. I think there could be more done in this area because right now, the controllers that run on these systems don't actually know that anything's happening, that they're in danger, that they're being told to get out of there. Us and Google have a slightly different policy. Google will actually kill pods after 30 minutes for an upgrade. We'll just back off and say, hey, no, you got to fix it on your own. So I kind of approach this from the idea that maybe we can make some sort of open source product to show people, hey, you can escape this. We at first thought, well, these PDBs are mostly stateful sets and we won't be able to do anything. But looking at our data, they're actually mostly deployments that mostly have a max surge. So we think a lot of these are mistakes or kind of temporary conditions that people could work around. So I have another way of kind of approaching this right now, which is I can trigger off of cordon nodes and say, oh, we know that these pods are probably going to be evicted. But I still think there's kind of a missing gap in the ecosystem to say, hey, your pod is kind of in danger. I think that'd be useful not just to my project, but to a lot of different projects. Like I think we also own a variant of the etcd operator that would very much like to know, oh, I'm about to get a pod evicted. Let me go set up another replica, make sure we got quorum, and then let that through. I think there's been some discussion on the issue about, do we need a bigger API? So the evacuation API is proposed by Philip. I don't have a problem with that. I just think it's going to take a long time to get a lot of the ecosystem moved over to that. He's pointed out that my stuff fails when the webhook eviction, so there's a webhook between eviction and the API server can block these things, you don't know about them. That's totally fair. I just don't see that many eviction webhooks out there. Those eviction webhooks could still also annotate the pod to say, hey, I blocked your eviction, and you kind of get the same effect. So I still think this is a useful thing that could help a lot of different controllers. It's a pretty cheap thing to do, and people can action on it kind of in the next release. But I wanted feedback on if people thought this is something that should wait for the evacuations API, or if this is a nice shorter term solution. That's the context.
So I'm curious of one thing. You've mentioned that you want to expose the information about a problem at the pod level. Why specifically at the pod level and not at the PDB level? The problem with the pod level is that pod in general should be replaceable. And I would expect people either to monitor their PDBs or their deployment rather than the pods, especially that in your case, you explicitly mentioned deployments.
Yep.
So in the majority of the cases, if your application is properly written, you will only care about the higher level primitives rather than the lowest one, especially that, as mentioned, they can come and go. So I'm curious about that part of the proposal that I remember in the Slack channel, you pointed out to a PR that you started working on, and you had a proof of concept where you are actually adding additional information to the pod. Because if we are invoking eviction, oftentimes the eviction event might potentially apply to several pods at a time, even though we're always acting on one within like a greater app if you're draining entire node. So exposing that at slightly higher level would allow us to squash that information slightly bit. So
And you're thinking squashing it. So in my mind, you do it at the pod level because it's lower and then it bubbles up to other things. So the PDB might notice that and then take that in, and then something else can action off the PDB. But then it's not restricted to just things that are aware of PDBs. Like if the replica set controller wanted to action off of it, I'm assuming it kind of only looks at pods and not looks at PDBs. So that's why I started at the PDBs. It's the lowest level that other operators can then go aggregate that data out. Like there's in my mind, if ignoring the evacuations API, if replica sets want to do something here, replica sets would watch pods and say, I have some back pressure from evictions, put an annotation on itself saying like, I have this much eviction back pressure. And then deployments itself that knows about the surge amount could decide on if it wanted to actually increase the replica set or not. So I kind of see pods as, hey, the lowest level of what's actually going on. And other controllers bubble that stuff up to higher controllers as it goes.
Liv, did you had any thoughts or suggestions? I read through both the thread and the issue, and you're basically circling around the eviction API, which, as you know, I'm somewhat hesitant on pushing forward. One of the reasons behind is that I'm worried about the actual both the implementation and the adaptation. Basically sharing to what Paul was saying, that one, it will take some time to get it out the door, and then secondly, it will take significant portion of time before people actually start moving from one to the other.
Okay, so yeah, while that's true, like this would be like a faster solution. Like I will try to summarize like the issues I see with that. Like mainly one point is there is a reliability problem of this. So basically, like since this is like let's just keep aside all the like the conditions or the variables we have to check to set this condition. But let's say we know certainly that we can set this condition. So eviction request goes and we set the condition. So there is no guarantee like from either side that somebody will react. First, like as Paul mentioned, like there is a lot of projects. I think you also found a couple of them that use the validating webhooks, and basically we would have to like, so let's say you have like some node drainer or some solution that drains the node and or other drainer, and they expect this condition to be set. So to have this API to be reliable, we would have to ensure that all the other users using the webhooks are also setting this condition, which is very hard to achieve. And even if we convince some of them, right, there will always be some that will either forget to set this condition, or there will be a problem of, if you have multiple webhooks, there will be a problem of synchronizing this. And like we have an alternative in the eviction request where we also try to solve this via two conditions, which was this was a bit more advanced case than this, that we had actually had a communication with the controller or I mean the evictor. But we were discussing this, and if you have like multiple actors, like synchronizing on a pod object is not very like a good solution. So that means you first have to give RBAC rights to the status of the pod. And so first are the RBAC rights, and second is the synchronization and the conflicts of updates of this pod status. So that was one of the problems. So like the reliability of that, like if you can depend on this condition that it will be there. And my second like main like con to this is that do we actually want to be responsible for I mean for the whole like deletion process? So if you set this condition, there also has to be somebody who removes it or decides when to remove it. And this is dependent very much on the application. And basically we would be responsible for that condition, when to set it, when to remove it, and then to also see all the conflicts and all the variables. Like as I said, we can go deeper into when to set these conditions. There is other multiple considerations. But yeah, these are two my main points.
I think that's fair. So I don't think it's a reliability problem, because when it fails, so if a webhook just straight up blocks it, you just fall into the case that you have today, where things are blocked, the node drainer repeats. So you don't actually get to any worst case scenario if someone installs a webhook, besides you go back to failing to evict, which is where you were before. I didn't find that many popular projects that were doing a webhook maintenance one. Now, I have no ability to go do a complete survey and figure out which one's there, so I'm happy for suggestions on other kind of popular projects that are using eviction webhook ones, but I don't see it as that much of a problem. If somebody puts it in, then their next disruption will get blocked and they'll fail, and they'll figure that out. Again, it doesn't cause a problem. It just takes you back to the old situation. Taking a RBAC on the pod status is totally true. That's kind of a bit more than most might want. Having it on a smaller API would be better. But also its status, it's not the end of the world. It's not spec, they're not mutating the pods or anything like that. And then I think the big part of your proposal kind of comes around, well, what if we want to do alternatives to deletion, like live migration? This one's gathering somewhat. That's interesting. I just haven't touched that area at all, so I don't know if that's a big concern for other people or not. For us, it's fine to leave the deletion in the API server. Again, the node drainer, whoever's trying to drain things, be it an autoscaler or something else, just keeps retrying, and eventually the API server says yes, you go into terminating, and kind of go from there. So still not a huge problem for me. So I'd still like to do it, but I acknowledge some of these concerns.
Yeah, so yeah, I can continue on these topics if you want, or Maciej, do you want to add something to this?
Go ahead. I'm thinking through a different scenario in my head currently, so go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so like this is certainly true, like you could only set this in some cases, but like I mean the usability of that diminishes a bit. Like one main point is like observability, that we have issues today that people actually don't know what's happening with regards to the life cycle of their pod today. And in some of the cases, like some condition would magically appear, in some of them it would not. So that's one con to that. And another one is that so far as I've seen in your proposal, that you would need to maybe you would basically detect if the PDB has a disruption allowed to 0, and then you would set the condition. And then we would, for example, could support the use cases as I am going over in my CAP. For example, for the auto scaling via the deployment controller or the HPA. But in general, we would like to support these use cases also when the disruptions allowed are bigger than 0, not just in this edge scenario. So that's a bit problematic in that case. So basically, I do not see how we could support that, or when the PDB is missing.
Yeah, my proposal is definitely more coupled to PDBs. It kind of still says PDB is the only way to block things, just like they are today. So I think that's fair. I think people are still. A fun question we have is like, do people really understand PDBs? Do they just throw PDBs over the wall? Do they, when they're doing HPAs, do they understand how they should set PDB? Should it be on the min? Should it be on the HPA's like current replica count minus a couple? So again, I totally acknowledge that there, but on the other hand, PDBs are widely deployed throughout the system right now. So there is that. Going back to should it be on the PDB, I wouldn't be against that. I still think it's better to be down at the pod, but that would at least give some insight to, hey, we're getting some pressure that this PDB is blocking. Where today you really get nothing if the PDB is blocking everything besides going and interjecting that webhook. So that would be an alternative. Again, still think the pod is a bit better here. The evacuation stuff is really nice, but I think you're gonna have the same problem that you're kind of describing, where if one app is not doing evacuations, then you kind of miss that if it's going back to evictions. And it might be even helpful for the evacuation API to see, oh, there is still something doing evictions. Maybe it's getting blocked or not. Surfacing that information so they can say like, oh, this is what needs to be moved over, actually could be helpful.
First to react to the eviction request or evacuation API, now called eviction request. Like basically we are trying to solve these problems there, that we have like a contract through the API. So each of the actors has to do their own thing. And if somebody wants to have a special behavior in the deletion process, then they put an annotation on the pod, and then when the API gives them their like the chance, they will react to this, and we have like a deadline that if that passes, we will put this to another evictor or interceptor, or we will fall back to the eviction itself. So like basically we try to solve these problems with like a more rich API. So all the edge cases are covered.
Can I ask a question about your evacuation? Sorry, it's no eviction request API. In like a default Kubernetes system, would there be an interceptor that does pod deletion that takes over that from the API server?
So basically, there would be a controller, and the default would be that we would like do basically eviction requests in the loop. That's the default.
So once there is an eviction request, you need an interceptor, if I'm getting your term right, to actually go and finally kill the pod, or does the API server act as an interceptor and eventually pick those up?
No. Like if you want to do, for example, some more clever migration of the pod, for example, we had I saw a request in one issue today, or like a couple of days back, about resource reservation. So when you have some important pod and you want to always be sure that you can run the next pod, then you first have to be sure that the pod keeps running, and then you can try to create second pod which has the same resource request. And once you know that you can run that pod, you can kill the other pod. So it would be like this migration, and this would be an example for an interceptor. So they would basically do this, like the migration of this important pod.
So there's still the old eviction API that's not being torn out, and that doesn't get transformed into eviction request that's handled there. So there's still, you still can have actors on the, so in like our clusters, we have like 4 different actors that do evictions. We have clustered autoscaler, we have, you can think of them as external actors that are trying to do an operation on the cluster, like an upgrade or scale down. We have descheduler. Like, do you see all those getting funneled through eviction requests, or still using evictions and then kind of being slowly moved over? And in the interim, how do you kind of deal with some stuff coming through evictions and some coming through eviction requests?
Yeah, exactly. Like we have looked at this, and there are not so many components using the evictions. So we would basically move them over to eviction requests, and that would be the new behavior. And since we are still falling back to the eviction, like the eviction is still supported, so you could have a mix of that, but you would get the nicer behavior with the eviction request.
So I think that's fine, but I think it still kind of parallels my proposal, where if you're using the normal eviction API, you get to see the conditions, stuff can react to it. And it's only if you try and do something fancier that you kind of fall out and can't get it. So I still think this is kind of a nice short term that does not block eviction requests at all. I understand maybe it takes some mind share away from it, that people might waste their time working on this condition when maybe they should be moving towards the full eviction request API. And there I kind of say, okay, out of my purview, if that's what we want to double down on and say eviction requests are really kind of the future, that's okay. And I can try and actually support some of that. I own some of those tools that do evictions today. So
Yeah, like I can see the condition working in some capacity, but I think there is we can go through these cases. There is a lot of cases where this would basically not work out well. So as you said, like we could only support the PTBs, but like I, for example, talked with people from the autoscaling, and they would like to have a nicer behavior, for example, for the HPA. So there would basically would not be any degradation in availability of the application, and this would mean that we would like to first contact the HPA, so it starts autoscaling out first before deletion. But this also presumes it would work when the PDB still has some disruptions allowed.
Yeah, that goes back to the question of like how should PDBs and HPAs interact? Should they follow the min on the HPA, or should they follow the current requests? Yeah, that's a really fun topic. Have you talked to the HPA guys? Are they like, we don't want to try and update PDBs at all? Like, you could have a situation where the HPA owns PDBs and says, I will use this to keep something up, but they're not interested in that or haven't talked to them yet.
Yeah, I've talked to them, and I've shown them my cap of the eviction request, and they were fine with that. They would like to use it, so they would like to have a better behavior. So like basically what I'm saying is like if we go with your solution, like with the condition, like what's the main proposition value, since we have all these other cases that this would not solve correctly? Like what would be the main like advantage?
The main one is still someone sets a PDB on a statically scaled deployment that has max surge, and either there's a single pod that's sad and so you can't kick something off because it's a lot of disruptions, or they actually just set it to be very constrictive. So a fun case here is if you have a cheap cluster and you're like, I have a deployment of one replica, but I still don't want it to go down when a single node goes down. If I set my PDB to allow disruptions, sorry, min available 1, then I'm stuck and I can never move that node. But really, you could move it. You could surge it. So I totally agree. It's a smaller set of cases, but I still think it's a significant set of cases because PDBs are so widely used today.
Yeah. So if I can circle back to the management of the condition. So let's say we want to support this single case for the like when the disruption is blocked.
Yeah.
I still do not see how we can well manage the condition. So for example, I mean it would sort of work well in the drain case, but for example, when you have the descheduler case, it goes over the pods and tries to evict one, and it sees it does not go through, and it will evict another. And so the first pod is not again is not like should not scale out of the node because there is another one that should be disrupted. And so basically we do not have like a control of the entity doing the evictions, like, or what is their meaning behind the eviction.
So let me try and parse that a little bit. When the second pod that you go onto, is it part of the same PDB as the first one, or is it a completely different PDB?
That's a completely different pod or end-to-end PDB.
Then why do we not want the first one to scale out?
Because like for example, the descheduler or some other drainer will decide there is like a better pod. And this also goes for the drain. Like when you have the drain, I mean, usually it goes, but we had also, we were also discussing that in some cases, it might be possible to actually cancel the drain. So yeah, that's one other point.
I'm not 100% sure I understand that case, Philip. If there's an eviction of the first pod and that failed for being blocked by PDB, and then it moves to a different pod, the condition set on the first pod would still be legit, even though it would move to something else, because that was the potential for this particular one. It couldn't be moved, but it should most likely. I'm thinking about a controller which would be responsible for eventually clearing those conditions on those pods after whatever we would come up with, like some timeline. I don't know, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever, something like that. And then they will basically, if you react and do something, it should probably disappear and will be able to move. But if you don't react to the pod, it eventually might be killed or whatever, or it will, the condition refresh with, yeah. So I don't want to, the entirely new API has a lot of risks. And as long as I acknowledge the fact that it will cover all the cases, the proposal from Paul does not neglect the eviction API. I would still be inclined to push forward a condition which would allow us to express at least partial information. I'm fully aware that it won't be perfect, but I think that with a minimal amount of effort, we can actually solve at least 50 or even more use cases that the people are going after, and what you are going after in your evacuation API as well. Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
So I think there is even like, because the main issue that's connected to this is that if you want to solve this problem that you have PDB is blocking, then we should be also solving autoscaling. And I think, as I mentioned before, I do not see this working well with the autoscaling.
I will admit that I haven't looked too deeply into the autoscaling pieces, and I need to revisit it because I have some thoughts, but I wasn't able to verify all of them. So that's still stands, and I'm not saying that we will be able to resolve all of the cases. Yeah. Go ahead, Paul. I believe you were trying to say something.
I'm happy to take a follow-up item and go talk to some of the auto-scaling folks to get their thoughts on PDBs. Because I'm really kind of interested. Are they like thinking, oh yeah, we should be more deeply involved in PDBs, or we tried that, it didn't work out for us. We want to take a new route, maybe like eviction requests. Because right now, like the toy project that I have, I'm actually putting in logic to say if you have an HPA, don't touch this thing. If somebody's doing something more complicated, they're trying to be smart, just ignore it for now. But it would be better to have a solution that said like, hey, here's HPA's stance on PDBs. Like the recommended guidance is to try and drag your PDB along with the autoscaler or set it to min. So maybe let me take a follow-up on that. I think that's fair, and come back on this. Like I said, we have a cordon signal right now that gets us most of what we're looking for. So I don't need this urgently, and I kind of want to find some other people that are interested in it too. So I still think this is a good proposal, but I'm happy to take a little bit more work to try and round out some stuff.
Yeah, that would be nice because getting that kind of information or that kind of feedback, how they could react better, will be probably reasonable, and we can return to this topic, I don't know, like in 2 weeks or something like that, or just follow up on Slack or in the GitHub issue. Although probably Slack is better. I'm hard with following what's going on in the issues usually in GitHub.
Is there anybody in HBA land that I should particularly try and get their opinions on? I'm going to go to their Slack and try and start a conversation there and take a look at some of the code and issues. But if there's somebody else that we know that I could give a hug to, that'd be good.
Philip, do you remember who were you talking to from the autoscaling?
Yeah, I just went to their SIG call, so maybe you could do that. And if like let us know, and I can join also. We can try to discuss it.
Cool.
Okay, cool. So let's follow up on that, and then we can continue the discussion. I would really like to see some movement in that direction, personally. Okay. I believe that was the only topic for today. So thanks very much, everyone, and see you next time. Bye, folks.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
holding.
Bye.